dad sat across from me at the kitchen table the week before Thanksgiving and told me the family trip to Aspen was beyond their budget this year. He said it with the same calm voice he used when he told me things he had already decided I would accept. Flights were expensive, he said. The lodge cost more than expected. There simply wasn't enough to cover a fourth person. I nodded. I said I understood. I told him not to worry about me, that I would figure something out for the holiday. He looked relieved in the way people look when they were afraid of a problem, and then the problem disappeared. My brother had already booked his ticket. I found that out the way I found out most things about my family, not because anyone told me, but because I happened to see it. He posted from the airport lounge 2 days before Thanksgiving, a photo of him holding a glass of something amber-colored, our parents sitting behind him in leather chairs that cost more per hour than my first car payment. The timestamp was 11 in the morning. They had left while I was at work. No one had called. No one had mentioned they were heading out early. The caption said something about grateful for family and holiday adventures, and I sat in the parking lot of my office and read that caption 4 times. Then my brother sent me a text. Just one line, honestly, this trip is better with just the 3 of us. I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and sat there for a few minutes. I had grown up learning to absorb things quietly. That was what you did when you were the second child, the younger one, the girl who never made a fuss. You absorbed things and then you kept going. But something was different that afternoon. The hurt was familiar. The silence around it was not. For the first time I could remember, I didn't reach for the explanation that would make their behavior okay. I didn't search for the reason that would let me forgive them before they had even noticed they needed forgiving. I just sat there. And then I started the car. And I drove to the airport. I need to take you back further, because what happened at that airport, what happened in the months after, none of it makes sense without the years that came before it. I was the easier child. That was the word my parents used when they talked about me to other people, and I heard it often enough that I started to believe it was a compliment. She's the easy one. She doesn't need much. She figures things out on her own. My aunts and uncles would smile when they heard this. My teachers said things like self-sufficient and mature beyond her years. No one seemed to notice that easy was another word for ignorable. My brother was 4 years older, and from the beginning he occupied a different kind of space in our family. When he was struggling in high school, my parents hired tutors. When I struggled in middle school, I was told to try harder. When he got into a mediocre college, they threw a party with catering and invited half the neighborhood. When I got into a better school on a partial scholarship, my mom made my favorite dinner, and my dad said he was proud in a tone that sounded like he was reminding himself to say it. My brother's graduation from his mediocre college involved a trip to Vegas for the whole family. I graduated on a Thursday and we went to Applebee's because my dad had a coupon. I don't say these things to make anyone feel sorry for me. I say them because the pattern was real and consistent, and I spent so many years explaining it away that I forgot I was doing it. I told myself my parents were just more worried about my brother because he needed more guidance. I told myself they expressed love differently with each kid. I told myself a lot of things that let me stay at the table and keep passing the bread without anyone having to account for anything. The Thanksgiving trip was not the first time I had been left out of something. It was the first time I couldn't pretend it was an accident. I had been building something in the years before that conversation at the kitchen table. Something I hadn't told my family about, partly because I had stopped trusting them with things that mattered to me, and partly because I had learned early that sharing my progress with them meant watching it get compared unfavorably to whatever my brother was doing at the time. I was 26 when I got my contractor's license. I had been working in construction management for 3 years by then, starting as an assistant on job sites and working my way up through hours of unpaid studying and weekend certifications that no one asked me to get, but that I knew would eventually mean the difference between taking orders and giving them. My family knew I worked in construction. They described it to relatives as something I was doing until I figured out my real path. My brother was in pharmaceutical sales, and my dad talked about his commission structure at every family dinner like it was a subject worth mastering. I bought my first property at 27, a 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood that needed work. on a street that other buyers were avoiding because the comps looked soft and the school ratings were low. I had spent months studying exactly what made a neighborhood turn around before it turned. New coffee shops on corners, younger families starting to move in on the next street over, a city zoning change that most people hadn't noticed yet. I knew what the rehab would cost because I had spent 3 years watching contractors bid jobs and learning where the numbers were real and where they were padded. I did most of the work myself on weekends. I tiled the bathroom and patched the drywall and replaced every outlet in the house because the wiring was older than both of my parents combined. My family didn't know about any of it. When they asked how things were going, I said fine, things were fine, work was steady. They accepted that because they had never been particularly curious about the details of my life. The lack of curiosity had stung for years. By then I had started to use it as cover. By the time my dad sat me down to tell me the Aspen trip wasn't in the budget, I had 3 properties. The first house was rented to a young teacher who paid on the first of every month without fail. The second, a duplex I had bought after 2 years of careful saving, covered its own mortgage plus a little extra. The third was a commercial space on a block that had started to change in the ways I had been watching for. A brewery had just signed a 5-year lease 2 doors down, and I had gotten in before that information was public knowledge. On paper, I was worth more than my parents. They had no idea. I pulled into the airport that afternoon without a plan beyond wanting to see their faces. I found them near the airline check-in, my dad at the counter with his ID out, my mum rearranging things in her carry-on that didn't need rearranging, my brother on his phone with his back slightly turned, the way he stood when he was performing his own busyness. They looked like a complete unit. They looked like a family heading somewhere together. They were. My dad saw me first. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, then confusion, then the particular kind of discomfort that comes from being caught in something you didn't expect to be caught in. I told them I just wanted to say goodbye. Have a good trip, safe flights. My mum hugged me with the stiffness of someone who hadn't been prepared to see me. My brother looked up from his phone long enough to nod. My dad checked his watch and said something about boarding. The message was clear. The inconvenience of my presence was disrupting the timeline of people who had somewhere to be. I said I had to get going anyway. I had somewhere to be too. The general aviation terminal at our airport is a separate building on the east side of the property. Most people have never been in it. I had chartered a plane for a business reason that had nothing to do with the holiday, a meeting with a developer interested in a project I'd been working toward for 2 years, a meeting that happened to fall the day before Thanksgiving and happened to be in a city 4 hours away. The timing was coincidence. What it allowed me to do was not. The woman at the desk recognized me from my last charter and asked if I was ready. The pilot, a man about my dad's age with more courtesy in his handshake than my dad had shown me in a decade, met me in the lounge and said they were ready whenever I was. I thought about my family on the other side of the building, standing in the regular security line, taking off their shoes, folding their jackets into the plastic bins. I thought about my brother's text. I thought about the kitchen table and my dad's relieved expression when I told him I would figure something out. Then I followed the pilot out to the tarmac and boarded the plane. I was somewhere over Ohio when my phone started buzzing. Not from my family. They didn't notice I'd been at the airport long enough to wonder where I'd gone, and they had no reason to think about me at all until they landed and started their holiday. The calls were from my contractor on the commercial space, a quick update about the final inspection. I answered, took notes, and then looked out the window at the flat geometry of the Midwest below me and thought about what was waiting when I got home. I had spent the month before that trip quietly, methodically removing everything from my parents' house that belonged to me. It was more than they realized. Over the years, in the way you do when you are trying to earn a place in a family that has not quite reserved one for you, I had bought things for their home. A kitchen appliance here. Furniture I thought they needed. Shelving I put up myself because no one else was going to. A television for the living room when theirs broke, and I didn't want to watch them go without. I had told myself this was generosity. Standing in the airport that afternoon, I understood it for what it was. An attempt to purchase a belonging that was never for sale. I had rented a truck the Saturday before they left. I took the furniture I'd bought, The kitchen equipment, the shelves, the television. I took the decorative things I had chosen over years of holidays, the framed prints I had picked out, the throw blankets I had washed and folded and replaced when they wore thin. I left the walls where they were. I left what they had bought. What remained was theirs. It was also, it turned out, considerably less than they had assumed. I was not trying to hurt them. I want to be clear about that, even though I know how it looks. I was trying to stop hurting myself. Every object I'd ever placed in that house was a physical record of a belief I was done holding. The belief that if I was useful enough and generous enough and easy enough, eventually they would see me. Taking those things back was not revenge. It was an ending of a particular kind of hope. The meetings in Chicago went well. I flew home 2 days later with a signed letter of intent from the developer and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My family had landed by then. They had walked into the house. My mum called first. She didn't ask questions initially. She just said they were home and that some things seemed to be missing. Her voice was careful in a way it had never been when she spoke to me before, which meant she had already understood enough to know she was on uncertain ground. I told her the things that were missing were mine. I had bought them. I had taken them back. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said they hadn't realized how much of it was mine. I know, I said. That's part of what I'm telling you. My dad called the following evening. He didn't open with uncertainty. He opened with the tone he used when he felt his authority was being challenged, even and tight, a kind of controlled irritation. He said what I'd done was dramatic and unnecessary. I told him what was dramatic was being told they couldn't afford a ticket for me while they were buying rounds in an airport lounge. What was unnecessary was the text from my brother. My dad said those weren't the same thing. I agreed with him. I said his version of the story involved lying to his daughter. Mine involved taking back what was legally mine. I was willing to discuss which was worse. He didn't have an answer for that. He fell back on language about family and expectations and how things were done, and I listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he was finished I said I understood he was upset. I also said I wasn't going to apologize. The call ended shortly after. My brother texted me 4 days after I got home. The message said something about how I was making everything weird for everyone and that I needed to get over it. I read the message and put my phone down and went back to the permit application I was filling out for the commercial renovation. He wasn't wrong that things were weird. He was completely wrong about why. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt different from all the other silences my family had practiced around me. The previous silences had been comfortable, for them because my absence registered as nothing, and for me because I had trained myself not to need acknowledgement. This silence had texture. My mum sent a few texts that were careful and short. My dad didn't call again for almost 3 weeks. When he did, his voice was different. Not softer exactly, but less certain, the way someone sounds when the ground has shifted under them and they haven't fully found their footing. He asked how work was going. I told him things were going well. He asked if I was around for Christmas. I said I wasn't sure about my schedule yet. He let the conversation sit there for a moment before we said goodbye. It was the most honest exchange we had managed in years. My mum asked if we could have coffee in January. I agreed. She came to my neighborhood. She had never been to my neighborhood before, had never asked to come, and we sat at a table by the window of a place I liked, and she looked around like she was seeing a version of my life she hadn't known existed. She asked questions about my work that she had never asked before. I answered them. When I explained what I actually did, she listened in a way she hadn't before, and I could see her recalibrating something. Some picture she had been carrying of who I was and what my days looked like. I had not fit in that picture for a long time. She was only now noticing the frame was wrong. She said she'd been thinking about the years when I was growing up. She said she hadn't seen certain things clearly. She said she wanted to try to do better. I told her I appreciated that. I also told her that trying to do better and actually doing better were different things, and I needed to see the second one before I could invest in the first. She nodded slowly. She didn't argue. I asked her what she thought doing better looked like. She said she wasn't sure. That was part of what she was trying to figure out. I said that was at least an honest answer. We finished our coffee. I walked her to her car. She hugged me for longer than she usually did. It wasn't a repair. It was a beginning of something that might or might not become one. The family meeting happened in March. I chose a restaurant none of us had been to, in a part of town that didn't belong to any of our histories. I wanted neutral ground. I arrived first and took a table in the back, facing the door, and waited. My mom came in, then my dad. My brother arrived 7 minutes late, which was something he'd been doing my entire life, and which I had spent my entire life silently accommodating. I did not comment on it. I watched him sit down and look around the table and settle into the mild discomfort of a situation he hadn't been able to find a way around. I thanked them for coming. I said I had asked for the meeting because I wanted to talk about the family we had been, not to relitigate every grievance, but to make sure we were all looking at the same history before we decided what came next. My dad's expression tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being called to a table I had set. My brother looked like he was waiting for it to be over. My mum kept her hands folded on the table and watched me. I told them I had spent most of my life being called the easy one. I told them I had understood that to be a compliment, and then, much later, I understood it was an instruction. I told them the Aspen trip was not the first exclusion. It was just the first one that left no room for a comfortable explanation. I looked at my dad. I told him he had lied to me. I told him I had seen the lounge photos and received my brother's text within 20 minutes of his explanation about the budget. I told him I was not asking him to apologize. I was asking him to understand that I had understood and that things were different now. My brother said he thought I was being dramatic. I said I noticed he found that word useful when he was uncomfortable. He looked away. My mum asked what I needed from them going forward. I told her what I needed was to stop being an afterthought, to be included in plans the same way my brother was included in plans, to have the same willingness to show up from them that I had shown them my entire life. I said if those things were possible, I was open to a real relationship. I said if they weren't, I had already proven I could live without one. The table was quiet for a moment. My dad asked what I did exactly. With work, he said it in the way that meant he realized he had missed something but wasn't yet sure how much. I told him I owned several properties. I told him about the commercial space and the development deal I had just closed. I watched his face while I said it. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular calm of someone who has stopped needing to be believed and has started simply being true. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said that was impressive. I told him it was. I also told him I hadn't done it to impress anyone. I had done it because no one was coming to hand me anything, and I had understood that earlier than most people do, and I had decided to treat the understanding as a gift rather than a wound. The meal ended without any grand resolution. There was no tearful embrace and no complete accounting and no moment that felt like it belonged in a movie about families finding their way back to each other. What there was my mum squeezing my hand at the end, my dad saying he'd like to see the commercial space when it was finished, my brother saying nothing and paying for his own meal, which was the most he had contributed to anything in years. I drove home that night through the city I had learned to read block by block, the city I had invested in because I believed in what I saw when other people were still looking at what was wrong, the street where my commercial tenant was about to sign a renewal, the block where I was under contract on something new, the neighborhood I had bet on before it was a safe bet. The easy child was a role that had been assigned to me before I was old enough to refuse it. I had worn it for 30 years, and when I finally took it off, I was surprised to find there was nothing underneath it that needed to be rebuilt, only something that needed to be seen. I had been building it quietly the whole time, in offices no one visited, on job sites before dawn. In all the hours my family spent not asking what I was doing, I parked outside my apartment and sat for a minute before going inside. The city hummed around me the way it always did. My phone showed a message from my mum. It said she was glad we'd had dinner. It said she hoped we could do it again. I replied that I'd like that. And I meant it not because everything was repaired and not because I had forgotten the years that had made that dinner necessary. I meant it because I had stopped waiting for permission to take up space in my own life, and from that position, even a small gesture from someone who had once made herself impossible to reach felt like something worth receiving. The woman who had been told the budget didn't include her was sitting in a city she had partly learned to own. That was not something anyone had given her. It was not something they could take back. There's something I've been thinking about since that Thanksgiving. The way my dad looked relieved when I told him I'd figure something out. Not apologetic, not conflicted. Relieved. Like a problem had resolved itself without requiring anything from him. I spent a long time being that kind of easy. I spent even longer wondering why easy never seemed to translate into valued. What I understand now is that the life I built didn't happen despite being overlooked. It happened inside of it. Every time my family assumed I was fine and moved on, I had a few more hours to study a contract, drive through a changing neighborhood, learn something no one was going to teach me. The neglect was not a gift I should be grateful for. I want to be honest about that, because I've heard people say that version of the story, and it always rings a little false. Being ignored by your family costs something real. It cost me years of wondering what was wrong with me, but somewhere along the way I stopped spending that energy on the question and started spending it on the answer. That's the thing about integrity, and I don't mean integrity as a word people put on motivational posters. I mean the smaller version of it, the daily kind, the decision you make when no one is watching to do the thing that will matter in 6 months instead of the thing that feels safer right now. I bought that first house when it made no obvious sense. I did the work myself when I could have told myself I deserved a break. I kept the information private when every part of me wanted someone in my family to finally see what I was capable of. None of that was easy. All of it was a choice about the kind of person I was going to be when the situation finally turned. And the situation did turn, not because of luck and not because the universe corrected an imbalance on my behalf. It turned because I learned to read things other people weren't reading. Neighborhoods, contracts, the difference between what a property looked like and what it was worth. That's not intelligence in the way school measures it. It's the kind of thinking that develops when you stop expecting someone to hand you a map and you start drawing your own. I asked questions the administrative assistant wasn't supposed to ask. I stayed late when there was no one left to impress. I kept notes that no one ever saw. Over years, those habits compounded into something I couldn't have planned from the beginning, but couldn't have built any other way. The hardest part wasn't any of that. The hardest part was sitting at a restaurant table in March, looking at my dad and my brother and my mum, and choosing to say what was true instead of what was comfortable. I had been choosing comfort for 30 years. Not my comfort, theirs. My comfort had never really entered the calculation. Choosing to speak clearly, without anger but without apology, was the moment that required more from me than any business deal I had ever closed. If you've been the easy one in your family, the one who figures it out alone, the one whose absence gets registered only when something needs doing, I want you to know that the ease was never actually yours. It was assigned to you. What's yours is everything you built inside it, quietly, without permission, in the hours when no one thought to ask what you were doing. That belongs to you. It always has.